Tonight the cold moves quietly across the land, not with anger or noise, but with patience. Snow drifts down in slow, endless sheets, softening the edges of the world until even distance forgets itself. Somewhere far from crowded roads and warm cities, there is a village resting beneath that snow, small, old, and nearly forgotten. Its roofs are bowed with ice, its paths erased, its windows darkened early, as if the night arrived before anyone noticed. This is not a story of heroes racing against time, nor of loud disasters announced by sirens or alarms. It is a story of stillness, of doors that remained closed, of fires that burned low, of people who believed they had endured every winter there was to endure, until one storm arrived that asked nothing and yet demanded everything. Before we begin, settle yourself. Let your breathing slow. Imagine the hush of falling snow outside your walls, the way sound seems to fade when the world is covered in white. Allow the quiet to grow. This story unfolds slowly, like frost along a window pane. And now, let us step into the village just as the cold begins to deepen. The first sign was not the snow, it was the air. Those who woke before dawn felt it pressing against their chests when they stepped outside, thick, unmoving, as though the village had sunk into something deeper than winter. The sky hung low, a dull gray without direction or shape. No wind stirred the bare branches. Even the crows, usually restless, remained silent and unseen. The village had no single name that everyone agreed upon anymore. Older maps used one word, newer ones used another. Travelers rarely passed through, and when they did, they never stayed long. The village existed in a shallow valley, ringed by dark pines and low hills that caught the snow like open hands. In winter, the sun touched it only briefly, sliding across rooftops before disappearing again. People went about their routines that morning without urgency. A kettle was set on a stove. A door creaked open and closed. Footsteps crunched once, twice, then stopped as someone reconsidered going out at all. Winter had taught them patience, not panic. By mid-morning, the snow began. At first it fell lightly, small flakes drifting down as if undecided. Children pressed their hands to cold windows and watched, hoping school would be canceled, though school had already been a rare thing since last winter. Adults noticed the way the flakes did not melt when they touched wood or stone. They stayed sharp, dry, accumulating faster than expected. Still, no one worried. Storms had come before. Storms always passed. By afternoon the sky darkened further and the snow thickened, falling not straight down but slanting, though no wind could be felt. The world beyond the village faded, tree by tree, fence by fence, until distance ceased to exist. The hills vanished. The road became a memory. Inside the houses, fires crackled softly, soup simmered, blankets were pulled closer, conversations grew shorter, then stopped altogether, replaced by the simple comfort of being indoors while winter did its work outside. As evening approached, something strange happened. The snow did not slow. It did not roar or rage. It simply continued endlessly, quietly, piling against doors, sealing windows, filling every space that had once been open. The temperature fell so gradually that no one noticed until their breath lingered in the air inside their own homes. One by one, lights went out across the village. Lamps were turned low to save fuel. Candles burned down to stubs. People chose sleep early, believing that morning would bring calm. And so, as the cold deepened beyond anything recorded or remembered, the village did what it had always done. It slept. unaware that the storm had only begun to ask its questions. Sleep came unevenly that night. Some drifted into it quickly, wrapped in the familiar weight of blankets and habit. Others hovered in the shallow edges of rest, waking again and again without knowing why. Dreams felt heavier than usual, crowded with long corridors of white and doors that would not open. More than one person woke with the sense that something was listening outside, though there was no sound to prove it. The cold continued its careful work. It slipped beneath doors first, thin and unnoticed, crawling across floors like spilled water. It pressed against walls, testing the strength of old wood and stone, windows filmed over with frost from the edges inward, delicate patterns blooming and tightening until the glass turned opaque. Sometime after midnight, the last sound disappeared. The old clock in the meeting hall stopped ticking. A loose shutter that had tapped for years fell silent, frozen in place. Even the snow seemed to lose its whisper as the air grew too cold to carry it. The village sank into a stillness so complete it felt deliberate, as if the world were holding its breath. Inside one small house near the edge of the valley, a fire burned down to embers sooner than expected. The wood, cut months ago, had seemed dry enough. No one noticed the change at first. The room cooled slowly, gently, the way water cools after a long boil. Hands pulled blankets higher, bodies curled tighter. Sleep held on. Across the village, the same thing happened again and again. Stoves cooled, flames weakened. Fuel that should have lasted until morning failed quietly in the deepening cold. Metal contracted with faint, sharp sounds, tiny cracks like distant ice breaking on a lake. Pipes stiffened, then froze, locking water where it stood. Outside, the snow rose higher against walls and doors, packing itself tight, sealing the village not with force but with patience. Paths vanished completely. Even the memory of where one house ended and another began grew uncertain beneath the white. The night stretched. It did not feel like time passing, but like time settling, thick and unmoving. The darkness did not lift. No pale hint of dawn reached the valley. The sky remained the same dull, endless gray, pressing low, pressing close. In their sleep, the people dreamed of warmth, of summers long past when the river still ran clear and children's voices carried across open fields. These dreams came with a strange ache. As though the body remembered something the waking mind had already let go. By the hour that should have been morning, the village lay unchanged. No doors opened, no smoke rose, no footsteps marked the snow. The storm did not announce itself as the coldest. It did not need to. It simply remained. And the village, wrapped in habit and trust, slept on, while the cold settled deeper into every wall, every breath, every forgotten corner. What should have been morning arrived without change. There was no soft brightening of the sky, no thinning of shadows. The gray above the village remained fixed, like a ceiling too low to stand beneath. Time passed only because bodies shifted in their sleep, because breath slowed, because cold continued its quiet descent. In one house, someone stirred. It was not a full waking, just a moment of awareness, a faint tug from a dream that had grown uncomfortable. A hand reached out instinctively, searching for warmth, for the reassuring heat of another body, or the familiar edge of a blanket. The hand found only cold cloth, stiffened slightly by frost. The movement stopped. Sleep reclaimed its hold, heavier now, more insistent. Elsewhere, a doorframe cracked softly as the wood tightened. The sound echoed once, and then vanished into the deep stillness. No one heard it. No one could have, even if they were awake. The cold had swallowed sound itself, leaving the village wrapped in something thicker than silence. The storm continued to fall. Though it was impossible to tell how long it had been falling now, snow pressed against upper windows, sealing them in white. Lower windows were already buried entirely. Some houses were half lost beneath drifts, their shapes softened until they looked like small hills rather than places where people lived. The road out of the valley no longer existed in any meaningful way. Snow filled every hollow, smoothed every rise. Fence posts vanished, signs disappeared. Even the line of trees that once marked the edge of the village blurred into a single dark mass, their branches bowed low, creaking under a weight they had not been meant to carry. Inside the homes the air grew thin and sharp. Breath came slower now, deeper, as bodies tried to conserve what little warmth remained. Fingers tingled faintly, then not at all. Faces relaxed into expressions that looked peaceful, almost content, as though the cold were offering rest rather than taking it. Dreams changed. They became quieter, simpler. A single image repeated itself in many minds, a door opening inward to a room filled with light. No heat, no sound, just light, clean and pale, inviting. By the time the hour for morning prayers passed, nothing in the village moved. No cough broke the stillness, no fire was rekindled, no curtain was drawn back to peer outside. The storm had not shouted. It had not needed to. It had simply stayed long enough for sleep to deepen into something else entirely. And the village remained still, unaware that the night had already taken more than it would ever give back. By the time the storm reached its deepest cold, the village no longer felt like a place where people lived. It felt preserved. Snow pressed against walls and roofs with steady patience, its weight evenly distributed, as if the storm were careful not to disturb what lay beneath. The houses stood unchanged on the outside, their shapes intact, their doors closed as they had been the night before. There was no sign of struggle, no broken windows, no footprints leading away in panic, only quiet. Inside one of the larger houses near the center of the village, the ceiling creaked faintly as the temperature dropped further. Frost traced the beams like pale veins. A table was set with bowls that had never been cleared. A chair stood slightly askew, as though someone had risen briefly and then decided to sit again later. The cold settled into these rooms gently, claiming them inch by inch. Clocks had stopped during the night, their springs tightened past the point of movement. Time inside the village no longer advanced in any shared way. Each house existed in its own frozen moment, sealed off from the others by walls thick with ice and snow. Outside, the storm showed no sign of ending. Snow continued to fall from the same dull sky, though the flakes were smaller now, harder, more like grains of salt than feathers. They filled the air densely, erasing the last traces of depth and distance. The valley had become a hollow bowl of white, smooth, and unbroken. Far beyond the hills, the world went on. Roads were cleared, fires burned. People spoke of the cold in measured tones, comparing temperatures, remarking on how severe the winter had become. Somewhere, reports were written, forecasts adjusted, but the village lay too far off any main route, too small to be noticed quickly. No one came. Within the houses, bodies lay still beneath layers of cloth and wool. The cold had eased them into stillness, without pain, without alarm. It had taken advantage of trust in routine, in sleep, in the idea that morning always comes. The storm lingered another day, then another. Snow buried rooftops almost completely, smoothing them into gentle slopes. Chimneys vanished. The meeting hall disappeared beneath a white mound indistinguishable from the ground around it. From above, the village no longer looked like a settlement at all, but like a quiet field shaped by chance. Silence deepened, not empty but full, heavy with everything that had been left unfinished. And beneath the snow, the village waited, unchanged, holding its breath long after it no longer needed to. It ended without ceremony. There was no clear moment when the storm decided to leave, no dramatic lifting of clouds or sudden rush of wind. The snow simply slowed, then thinned, then stopped altogether. The sky lightened by degrees, pale gray giving way to a fragile blue that felt almost unreal after so long. Sunlight reached the valley for the first time in days. It touched the highest drifts first, glinting off the frozen surface, too weak to melt anything, but strong enough to reveal the shape of what lay beneath. The village emerged slowly, not as it had been, but as something altered, muted, sealed in place. The air remained bitterly cold, sharper now without the falling snow to soften it. Frost glittered everywhere, turning every surface into glass. The world felt hollow, as though sound might shatter it if it tried too hard to exist. Still, nothing moved. Hours passed in that thin daylight. Shadows shifted slightly, marking time for no one. The sun climbed and fell without drawing a single door open, without coaxing a single wisp of smoke from any chimney. By the second day of clear sky, a single sound returned. Far from the village, beyond the hills, an engine labored against the cold. The sound was faint, uneven, carried in pieces by the still air. It grew slowly, not louder so much as closer, as if the noise itself were unsure it should intrude. A vehicle reached the edge of the buried road and stopped. No one stepped out at first. The silence of the valley felt deliberate now, watchful. Snow lay too smooth, too untouched. The shapes beneath it were too regular to be natural. When at last someone moved, their footsteps broke the crusted snow with sharp, echoing cracks. The sound felt wrong in the stillness, almost disrespectful. A figure stood for a long moment looking out over the field of white, trying to reconcile memory with what lay before them. They had expected damage. They had not expected absence. As they moved closer, the outlines of buildings revealed themselves, corners of roofs, the top of a doorframe, the faint line of a wall. A hand brushed snow aside, uncovering wood so cold it burned to touch. The village had not been destroyed. It had been put to sleep. And now, at the edge of thawless daylight, someone had arrived too late to wake it. The first footprints looked wrong. They were too sharp, too sudden, pressed into snow that had otherwise remained untouched for days. Each step cracked the surface with a dry, brittle sound, echoing farther than it should have in the open valley. The figure moved slowly, testing the ground before committing weight, as if afraid the silence itself might break. The cold was immediate and punishing. It slipped through layers of clothing without effort, biting skin, numbing fingers within moments. Breath came out in short white clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared, stolen by the air. The village revealed itself reluctantly. A doorway emerged from the snow, half buried, its handle encased in ice. A window followed, its glass completely white, no hint of darkness or light behind it. The person brushed frost away with a gloved hand, clearing only a small circle before stopping. There was no movement inside, no shadow, no shift, No sign that anyone had ever stood on the other side. The door resisted at first. Ice had claimed its edges, sealing it in place. When it finally opened, it did so with a sharp, splintering crack that echoed through the empty streets. The sound lingered, unanswered. Cold air spilled out, heavier than the air outside, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of extinguished fire. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been left. A table stood set for a meal that had never been eaten. A cup rested on its side, frozen where it had tipped. Near the wall, a pair of boots stood neatly together, never put on. Frost coated every surface in delicate layers, softening outlines, preserving details. The stillness inside the house was complete. The visitor stood motionless for a long moment, unwilling to step further, as though movement might disturb something sacred or dangerous. The quiet felt intentional now, not empty but full, as if the house itself were holding a memory it refused to release. Outside, the sun dipped lower, throwing long blue shadows across the snow. The light did not warm, it only revealed. House by house, the same story repeated. Doors sealed, fires gone cold, rooms untouched by panic or struggle. The village had not tried to flee, it had not fought. It had simply trusted the night to pass. As the light faded, the visitor realized something unsettling. The village did not feel abandoned, it felt paused, as if at any moment a breath might be drawn, a footstep might sound, and the sleep might break. But evening came, and nothing stirred. The cold remained, and the footprints in the snow were still the only proof that the village had noticed it was no longer alone. At the far edge of the village, where the land dipped gently toward the frozen river, one house stood slightly apart from the others. It was smaller, older. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its windows were narrower, set deep into thick stone walls. The visitor had nearly passed it by, mistaking it for a drift shaped by chance, until the angle of the wall caught the fading light. The door here was not sealed. Snow had piled high against it, but the frame itself was clear, as though warmth from within had once resisted the storm just a little longer than elsewhere. The handle was bare of ice, dark metal against pale stone. The visitor hesitated. Something about this house felt different, not safer, not warmer, but awake in a way the others were not. The silence around it felt thinner, stretched tight, like ice before it cracks. The door opened without protest. Inside, the air was cold, but not lifeless. It carried a faint trace of smoke, old and diluted, as though a fire had burned here after the rest of the village had already gone quiet. The floor was swept clean. The furniture was sparse but orderly. No table was set. No meal waited unfinished. Near the hearth a blanket lay folded, not draped or dropped, but placed. On the wall above it, marks had been scratched into the stone. They were not words. They were tallies, uneven lines grouped together, some deeper than others, as if carved over many nights by unsteady hands. The visitor counted them slowly, losing track more than once, then starting again. The number was too large to be comforting. Beside the tallies, a final mark stood alone, cut deeper than the rest. The visitor stepped back, heart slowing, then quickening again for reasons that were difficult to name. The house felt less like a shelter and more like a record, proof that someone here had been awake while the village slept. Outside, the light failed completely. Evening returned, sharp and blue, and the temperature fell once more. Shadows filled the room, stretching and joining until the corners disappeared. As the door closed behind the visitor, A realization settled in quietly. The coldest part of the storm had not been the cold itself. It had been the waiting, and someone in this village had known that. The river lay just beyond the house, hidden beneath a broad sheet of ice and snow. From the village, it had always been a presence more than a sight, a muted sound in warmer months, a dark line cutting through the valley. Now it was silent, sealed beneath layers of frozen white, its surface smooth except where pressure had forced long, pale cracks to form. The visitor followed the slight downward slope, boots sinking deep with each step. The cold here felt sharper, drawn toward the open space as if the river itself were pulling warmth from the air. Near the center of the frozen surface, something interrupted the snow. A narrow opening, no wider than a doorway, had been cleared down to the ice. The edges were rough, scraped away by repeated effort. Snow had drifted back in places, but the shape remained unmistakable. Someone had been here. The visitor crouched, brushing snow aside with stiff fingers. The ice beneath was thick, clouded, layered with months of freezing. But near the center of the opening it bore signs of repeated impact, small fractures radiating outward, as though tools or stones had struck it again and again. A dark shape lay frozen just beneath the surface. At first, it looked like a shadow, caught mid-motion. Then the visitor's eyes adjusted, and the shape resolved into something unmistakable, an object held upright, angled as if deliberately placed before the ice closed over it. It was a lantern. The metal frame was intact, the glass frosted but unbroken. Inside, the wick was blackened, long since burned away. The lantern had been lit once, lowered carefully into the water, or set against thinning ice and left there as a marker. The visitor straightened slowly, breath shallow, now despite the cold. The lantern's presence felt intentional, patient. It had not been dropped in panic. It had been placed as if to say, here, beneath the surface, something waits. Behind the visitor, the village remained still, its houses dark and unchanged. Ahead, the frozen river stretched on, unbroken beyond the clearing, its depths sealed and unreachable. The storm had passed, but whatever had been done here belonged to the time when the storm still ruled the valley, when someone had been awake long enough to understand that sleep was not the only danger. The visitor turned back toward the house at the edge of the village, carrying a growing certainty. The story of this place was not only about those who slept through the cold, it was also about the one who did not. The house at the valley's edge drew the visitor back as if by gravity. Inside, the darkness felt less absolute now, as though the daylight had left behind a memory of itself. The visitor lit a small lamp, its glow weak but steady, and the room slowly revealed its details again. The tallies on the wall stood out more clearly in the lamplight. They were not evenly spaced. Some were carved close together, hurried, almost desperate. Others were separated by wider gaps, as though time itself had stretched thin between each mark. The visitor traced them carefully, noticing how the depth of the cuts changed, deep when the hand had been strong, shallow when it had weakened. Near the hearth, a small pile of wood lay stacked with care. Only a few pieces remained, each one thin, split smaller than usual, as if someone had tried to make the fire last as long as possible. Ash in the hearth confirmed it. The fire had been fed sparingly, never allowed to burn bright. Against the far wall, a narrow bed stood untouched. The blankets were folded, not slept in. Whoever had lived here had chosen not to lie down. The realization settled heavily. This was not a house abandoned in haste. It was a place of decision. Someone had understood what the storm was becoming and had refused the comfort of sleep, knowing that rest carried its own danger. On a low shelf near the door, the visitor found a small collection of objects laid out in a careful line: a chipped cup, a broken knife handle, a length of cord stiff with frost. Ordinary things, saved not for use but for remembrance. The final object was a scrap of cloth, darkened and frayed, tied with a simple knot. The visitor did not untie it. Some things felt like they should remain closed. Outside, the temperature fell again as night returned. The lamp flickered, its flame struggling in the cold air. The visitor adjusted it, then paused, listening. For the first time since arriving, there was a sound. It was not a voice, not footsteps. It was a slow, distant creak, ice shifting beneath pressure far out on the river. The sound traveled through the frozen ground, low and drawn out, like a deep breath taken by the valley itself. The person who had kept vigil here had listened to that sound night after night, marking time on stone while the village slept. And now, standing in the same room, the visitor felt the weight of that waiting settle close, an understanding that survival had once been possible here, but only through choice, discipline, and loneliness. The storm had passed, but the cost of staying awake through it remained, etched into the walls. Night settled fully over the valley again, though the storm was gone. Stars appeared faintly above the hills, sharp and distant, offering no warmth, only confirmation of how exposed the village truly was. The visitor stepped outside the house at the edge, closing the door carefully, as though someone inside might still be resting. The cold had changed. It was no longer aggressive. It no longer pressed inward with urgency. Instead, it lingered, deep, embedded, settled into stone and earth. This was the kind of cold that did not leave quickly, that stayed long after the cause was forgotten. The visitor walked slowly through the village, lamp held low. Its small circle of light skimmed over snowbanks and half-buried walls, revealing fragments of daily life caught mid-pause. A wooden sled leaned against a fence, frozen in place. A mitten lay near a doorway, stiff and untouched. A set of footprints, old ones, ended abruptly near a house, disappearing beneath drifted snow. None of them led away. At the center of the village, the meeting hall emerged as a rounded mound. The visitor climbed its slope carefully, brushing snow aside near where the door should have been. It took time to find it. When it finally opened, cold air spilled out, sharper than anywhere else. Inside, benches were arranged in a careful circle. The visitor raised the lamp. Every seat was empty, yet the room felt crowded, heavy with the sense of voices that had once gathered here, of shared decisions and shared silences. On the far wall, a single notice remained pinned, its edges curled and frozen. The visitor did not read it. Some messages, it seemed, belonged only to the time before the storm. As the lamp flickered, the visitor became aware of something else, something subtle but unmistakable. The quiet here was not complete. Beneath it ran a faint undercurrent, like pressure beneath ice, like breath held too long. The village was not finished telling its story. Outside, the cold crept onward, slow and patient, settling into the visitor's bones. It carried a warning now, quiet but clear. Storms do not always end when the snow stops falling. Some of them remain, and those who come after must decide whether to listen. By morning, the visitor had not left. A pale light returned to the valley, thin and fragile, revealing the same frozen stillness as before. The vehicle remained where it had stopped at the edge of the road, half buried now by drifting snow that had moved during the night. The path back was still possible, but it would not stay that way for long. The visitor stood outside the house at the valley's edge, breath slow, eyes scanning the hills. Leaving would have been easy in one sense, difficult in another. To go would mean carrying this place away as a report, a warning, a footnote in someone else's record. To stay, even briefly, meant accepting the weight of what had happened here. The silence, the waiting, the decisions made alone, in the cold. The door opened again. Inside, the house felt unchanged, but the visitor was not. The tallies on the wall no longer looked like marks of desperation, alone. They looked like discipline. Each line was a refusal to sleep, to surrender, to let the cold decide everything. The visitor added nothing to the wall. Some counts were finished. Instead, the visitor gathered what little remained usable. Wood stacked carefully by the hearth, a single blanket folded neatly, the lamp refilled with what fuel was left. The fire was lit again, just enough to take the edge off the air, never enough to waste heat. It felt wrong to let this place grow colder. Outside, the sun crept higher, its light glinting off the ice-covered river. The lantern beneath the surface remained where it was, frozen in place, marking a point no one could reach now. It no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a memory preserved on purpose. As the day wore on, the visitor listened to the subtle shifts of ice, to the faint creak of timber, to the long-stretched quiet of a place emptied but not erased. The village did not resist being observed. It offered itself slowly, one detail at a time. By evening, the decision was clear. The visitor would stay one more night. Not out of hope of change, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some places deserved to be kept warm a little longer, even if no one would ever wake there again. The fire burned low through the evening, its small movements reflected in the stone walls like slow breathing. The visitor sat nearby, wrapped in the folded blanket, listening to the way the house responded to warmth after so long without it. Wood shifted softly, ice cracked somewhere deep within the walls, releasing sounds that felt like sighs. Outside, the village remained dark. The stars sharpened in the sky, bright and indifferent. Frost crept back across the window edges, reclaiming the glass inch by inch. The warmth inside the house was temporary, both knew that. As the night deepened, the visitor became aware of a pattern. It began with the river. A low groan rolled through the valley, not loud but sustained, as ice adjusted to falling temperatures. Minutes later, another sound followed, a faint creak from the trees on the hillsides, their frozen branches shifting under weight. Then, closer, the house itself answered with a quiet crack from the roof beam. The sequence repeated: river, trees, house, again and again, spaced evenly like a slow, uneven clock. The person who had kept vigil here had listened to this rhythm. The tallies on the wall suddenly made sense. Not counting days, but nights. Each mark a full cycle endured without sleep, without relief. The visitor felt a subtle tightening in the chest, a shared awareness across time. The vigil had not been a single act of endurance. It had been many, repeated, each one harder than the last. The fire faded further, its light dimming, until shadows claimed most of the room. The visitor did not add more wood. The lesson of the house was restraint, not comfort. At some point near the deepest part of night, exhaustion pressed heavily. The blanket felt warmer, the floor seemed softer. Sleep offered itself gently, without threat, without urgency. The visitor resisted. Instead, they stood and stepped outside. The village lay under moonlight now, pale and unreal. Snow glowed faintly. The houses looked almost peaceful, as though merely resting. Near the river, the ice creaked again. The sound traveled through the visitor's feet, up through bone and breath, steady and patient. Standing there in the cold, the visitor understood something simple and terrible. The storm had not been the enemy. Sleep had been. And the one who stayed awake had known it, night after night, carving time into stone until there was no strength left to do anything else. The visitor remained standing until the sound passed, until the rhythm broke, until the night loosened its hold just slightly. Only then did they return to the house. Morning came thin and colorless. The fire had gone out some time before dawn, leaving only a faint warmth in the stones beneath the hearth. The visitor woke not from sleep, but from stillness, the kind where the body no longer knows whether it has rested or merely endured. Breath rose in pale clouds, even inside the room. Frost had formed along the inside of the walls during the night, delicate and precise, as if the cold were finishing a careful piece of work. Each breath touched it briefly, then vanished. The house held no illusion now. It was not shelter. It was a pause. Outside, the village looked unchanged, yet something subtle had shifted. The snow surface had hardened further, crusted and brittle. Each step cracked loudly now, breaking the illusion of gentleness the storm had left behind. The cold had settled into its final form, not dramatic, not violent, but absolute. The visitor moved slowly through the village again, this time not searching, but noticing. A window here, where frost patterns resembled leaves. A door there bowed slightly inward, as if the house itself had leaned toward warmth. A narrow path between two buildings, where snow lay thinner, shaped by footsteps that had once passed back and forth many times. Routine, unhurried, trusted. At the center of the village, the visitor stopped. Standing still, listening, it became clear that the quiet had layers. Beneath the obvious silence was something else, a kind of echo, not of sound, but of presence, as if the village remembered being occupied and had not yet learned how to forget. The visitor thought of the tallies again. How many nights had the vigil lasted before the body finally failed? How long could one remain awake while others slept, trusting that the storm would behave as storms always had? No answer came. Only cold. By late morning the sky clouded again, not with snow, but with a dull cover that promised no warmth. The visitor knew then that staying longer would change something essential. Vigil could slip into imitation. Respect could harden into attachment. The house at the edge had done its work. It had taught what it could. Returning there one last time, the visitor tidied what little had been disturbed. The blanket was folded again. The lamp extinguished. The door closed gently, not sealed, not locked. Some places needed to remain open. Outside, the visitor stood for a long moment, looking back across the village, committing its stillness to memory, not as tragedy alone, but as warning. Then, slowly, carefully, footprints turned toward the road out of the valley. The village did not resist. It did not call out. It remained what it had become, quiet, complete, and still listening. Morning came thin and colorless. The fire had gone out some time before dawn, leaving only a faint warmth in the stones beneath the hearth. The visitor woke not from sleep, but from stillness, the kind where the body no longer knows whether it has rested or merely endured. Breath rose in pale clouds even inside the room. The frost had formed along the inside of the walls during the night, delicate and precise, as if the cold were finishing a careful piece of work. Each breath touched it briefly, then vanished. The house held no illusion now. It was not shelter, it was a pause. Outside, the village looked unchanged, yet something subtle had shifted. The snow surface had hardened further, crusted and brittle. Each step cracked loudly now, breaking the illusion of gentleness the storm had left behind. The cold had settled into its final form, not dramatic, not violent, but absolute. The visitor moved slowly through the village again, this time not searching, but noticing. A window here, where frost patterns resembled leaves. A door there bowed slightly inward, as if the house itself had leaned toward warmth. A narrow path between two buildings, where snow lay thinner, shaped by footsteps that had once passed back and forth many times. Routine, unhurried, trusted. At the center of the village, the visitor stopped. Standing still, listening, it became clear that the quiet had layers. Beneath the obvious silence was something else, a kind of echo, not of sound, but of presence, as if the village remembered being occupied and had not yet learned how to forget. The visitor thought of the tallies again. How many nights had the vigil lasted before the body finally failed? How long could one remain awake while others slept, trusting that the storm would behave as storms always had? No answer came, only cold. By late morning the sky clouded again, not with snow, but with a dull cover that promised no warmth. The visitor knew then that staying longer would change something essential. Vigil could slip into imitation. Respect could harden into attachment. The house at the edge had done its work. It had taught what it could. Returning there one last time, the visitor tidied what little had been disturbed. The blanket was folded again, the lamp extinguished. The door closed gently, not sealed, not locked. Some places needed to remain open. Outside, the visitor stood for a long moment, looking back across the village, committing its stillness to memory, not as tragedy alone, but as warning. Then, slowly, carefully, footprints turned toward the road out of the valley. The village did not resist. It did not call out. It remained what it had become, quiet, complete, and still listening. The path out of the valley took longer than expected. Snow that had seemed firm gave way without warning, swallowing boots to the knee. Drifts shifted under weight, reshaping themselves with soft collapses that echoed strangely in the open space. The visitor moved carefully, pausing often, listening for changes in the air, the ground, the distant hills. Looking back, the village faded quickly. At first, rooftops remained visible, their shape softened but recognizable. Then only uneven mounds remained, scattered across the valley floor. Finally, even those disappeared, absorbed into the broad, unbroken field of white. The snow kept what it covered. At the ridge, the visitor stopped and turned one last time. From here, the village was invisible, indistinguishable from any other frozen hollow. No marker remained, no sign warned of what lay beneath. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling thing. Beyond the ridge, the road reappeared, narrow and uncertain but passable. The vehicle waited where it had been left, crusted with frost, silent. The visitor cleared snow from the door and paused again, hand resting on the cold metal. Memory pressed close now, not as images, but as weight. The tallies on the wall, the lantern beneath the ice, the untouched bed, the rhythm of river, trees, and house. These things would not travel easily. They resisted summary. They did not fit into neat explanations or simple warnings. The engine started reluctantly, its sound harsh in the still air. As the vehicle moved away, the valley slipped from view, folded back into the landscape as if it had never held anything at all. Far away, people would speak of the winter in numbers, temperatures recorded, storms ranked, records broken. The village would not appear in those accounts. It would exist only in the knowledge carried by one person who had stood in its quiet, who had felt the truth of what cold could do when met with trust and sleep. And the snow would continue to fall in other valleys, soft and patient, waiting for places that believed they already understood winter. The road unwound slowly through the hills, bordered by drifts that rose higher than the vehicle's hood. The engine's hum became a constant presence, steady and grounding, yet it could not fully drown out the quiet that lingered in the visitor's thoughts. Even moving away, the village did not feel distant. It traveled inward instead. Every pause at a bend in the road carried the sense of something being counted, not miles, not time, but attention. The visitor found themselves slowing without meaning to, listening for sounds that were no longer there. The creak of ice, the soft collapse of snow, the hush of a place that had learned stillness too well. At a higher elevation, wind returned. It cut across the road in sharp gusts, lifting snow into brief spirals before letting it fall again. The cold here felt different, active, restless, impatient. It reminded the visitor that not all winters kill through silence. Some announce themselves loudly and leave quickly. The valley had not. When the first signs of another settlement appeared, fences cleared of snow, smoke rising faintly from chimneys, the visitor felt a strange hesitation. Life resumed there as it always did, warm and fragile and unaware of what lay only a few ridges away. Stopping briefly, the visitor stepped out of the vehicle and listened. Sounds returned at once, distant voices, the creak of a door, the rhythmic strike of metal against ice. They felt almost overwhelming after so long in quiet. The air here carried warmth by comparison, though it was still winter. No one asked where the visitor had come from. No one needed to. The visitor rejoined the road, carrying the memory carefully now, not as something to share easily, but as something to guard. Some knowledge once spoken lost its shape. Some warnings worked only when held close, guiding choices quietly rather than loudly. The coldest storm had passed. But its lesson moved on, embedded not in snow or stone, but in awareness, an understanding that endurance sometimes required wakefulness, restraint, and the courage to remain alert when rest felt safest. The road stretched onward, and somewhere behind it, beneath layers of patient snow, the village remained asleep, unchanged, waiting for nothing at all. Days passed. The visitor moved farther from the valley, crossing regions where the winter had been harsh but survivable. People spoke of frozen nights and empty roads, of how close the cold had come to being dangerous. They shook their heads, laughed softly, and said things like, "We were lucky this time." Luck sounded thin. Each evening, as the visitor rested wherever shelter allowed, sleep came reluctantly, not from fear but from memory. The body remembered standing through the night, listening to ice speak. It remembered the discipline of staying awake when comfort whispered invitations. On the third night, snow began to fall again, not heavily, not dramatically, just enough. From a window, the visitor watched flakes gather on the sill, softening the edges of the world. The sight should have been calming. Instead, it carried weight. Snow was patient. It did not rush, it did not warn. Somewhere beyond sight, another village might be settling into routine. Fires lit, lamps dimmed, trust placed gently in sleep. The visitor stood and checked the door, checked the fire, checked the windows, not because danger was certain, because attention mattered. In the quiet that followed, a realization settled fully, without fear or urgency. The village in the valley had not been unique. It had simply been the first place where conditions aligned perfectly: cold, isolation, trust, habit. That alignment could happen again, not everywhere, not often, but often enough. The visitor lay down at last, not surrendering to sleep, but entering it carefully, lightly, ready to wake at the smallest change. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent, beautiful, exact. The storm did not need to be remembered by name. Its pattern was enough. Morning arrived with no sign of trouble. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving behind only a thin, even layer that reflected the pale light of dawn. The world looked calm again, harmless in its familiarity. Roofs held their shape, roads were passable, smoke rose from chimneys in lazy threads. Life continued. The visitor stepped outside and stood still for a long moment, listening not just to sound, but to absence. The quiet here was ordinary, incomplete. It carried gaps filled with movement, a distant voice, the scrape of a shovel, the soft bark of a dog somewhere nearby. This was not the quiet of the valley. That difference mattered. As the day passed, the visitor paid attention to small things others overlooked: how quickly fires burned down, how often people spoke of being tired, how easily routines replaced awareness. None of it was dangerous on its own. Together, it formed a pattern the visitor now recognized. Winter trained people to endure by habit. Habit, the visitor had learned, could be a kindness or a risk. In the afternoon, clouds thickened again, heavy but undecided. The visitor helped reinforce a doorframe, shared a suggestion about rationing fuel, spoke casually about keeping lamps ready. The words were simple, unremarkable, easily accepted. No one asked why. By evening, the sky cleared again, offering stars and cold. Inside, warmth held. Sleep came more easily this time, not because vigilance had faded, but because it had been shared, spread quietly into the structure of the place. The visitor woke once during the night, listened, then rested again. Some lessons did not require standing alone. Some could move gently from one place to another, changing small decisions, slowing routines, keeping a little more light burning through the longest hours. Far away, beneath deep snow, the village remained as it was, but its stillness had begun to echo elsewhere, not as tragedy, but as understanding. Weeks passed, marked not by dates, but by weather. Cold settled, lifted slightly, then returned again, never quite the same twice. The visitor moved on when it felt right, leaving behind places that now carried a little more awareness than before. Not warnings carved into walls, not stories told loudly, just habits adjusted, fires watched more closely, nights respected, sleep treated as something earned rather than assumed. The memory of the valley softened without fading. It no longer arrived as images alone, but as instinct, a sense for when silence became too complete, for when cold stopped being loud and began to listen. The visitor learned to notice the moment when a place leaned too heavily on routine, trusting tomorrow without preparing for it. In one settlement, the visitor stayed only a night. Snow fell steadily there, thick enough to erase tracks by morning. The buildings were close together, sheltering one another from wind. People gathered indoors early, laughing, sharing warmth. The visitor joined them, listened more than spoke. Later, alone in a small room, the visitor woke before dawn. Not from fear, from recognition. The quiet had changed. Outside, the snow had piled faster than expected. The wind had died completely. The air pressed inward, dense and unmoving. It was not danger yet, but it was the beginning of the same question the valley had asked. The visitor dressed and stepped into the hall. A few lamps were lit. A fire still burned. Someone else was awake too, sitting near the hearth, eyes heavy but alert. They exchanged a glance, nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Together they added wood slowly, carefully. They kept the fire alive without letting it blaze. They stayed awake until the sky lightened again, until sound returned to the air. Morning came. Nothing had been lost. No one spoke of it later. There was no need. The lesson had passed between them in silence, complete and intact. Far behind, beneath snow that would not melt for many seasons, the village remained asleep. It had given what it could give, not survival, not warning, but understanding. And understanding, carried quietly, proved to be the warmest thing the storm could not take. As winter stretched on, the visitor began to notice a change, not in the weather, but in themselves. Sleep no longer arrived as an escape. It came as a balance. Rest was taken in layers, never all at once, never without listening first. Even in warmth, even among people, part of the mind stayed gently alert, like a lamp left burning in the next room. This was not fear, it was memory, reshaped into care. In one place, a storm stalled overhead for 3 days. Snow fell steadily, then stopped, then fell again, as if testing patience. Roads closed, supplies thinned. People settled into waiting, confident it would pass. On the second night, the visitor noticed the fires burning too brightly, wood being used too quickly, not out of panic, out of comfort. The visitor said little, only adjusted their own fire, letting it burn low and steady. Others noticed. One by one, flames across the room softened. No one announced the change. It happened naturally, like breathing slowing when a room grows quiet. Outside, the storm lingered, then moved on. The visitor did not stay long after that. These places did not need guidance anymore. They had learned how to listen for themselves. And still, sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, the valley returned, not as guilt, not as sorrow, as a still image beneath snow, complete and untouched. The visitor understood now that the village had not failed. It had trusted what had always worked before. It had lived well, endured often, and rested deeply. The storm that took it had been rare, not cruel, just exact. There was no anger in that realization, only responsibility. To notice when silence deepened too far, to recognize when rest became surrender, to keep one small flame alive when the world felt too quiet. The coldest storms did not shout. They waited. And those who learned to stay awake just a little longer carried something precious forward, something fragile, invisible, and strong enough to pass from place to place without ever being named. Spring came slowly that year, not with warmth, but with change so subtle it could be missed entirely. Snow softened at its edges, ice lost its voice, cracking less often, holding less tightly. Streams began to whisper beneath their frozen skins, testing movement again. The visitor felt the pull before understanding it, a quiet insistence, a sense of something unfinished, not unresolved, but unacknowledged. When the roads finally opened enough to allow passage, The visitor turned back toward the valley. The journey felt different now. The cold no longer pressed inward with authority. It receded when challenged, yielding ground reluctantly. Days lengthened, light lingered. At the ridge the visitor stopped. Below, the valley lay unchanged in shape, but altered in texture. Snow had settled, compacted, dulled. The surface no longer sparkled. It absorbed light instead of reflecting it, heavy with time. The village began to emerge. Roofs appeared first, their outlines softened but intact, then walls, then doorways, still closed, still patient. Meltwater traced faint paths through the snow, dark lines marking where gravity remembered its work. The visitor descended slowly. At the center of the village, water dripped steadily from eaves, a sound that felt impossibly loud after so much silence. The drip did not hurry, it simply continued, proof that time had begun again. Inside the houses, nothing had changed. Cold still lingered in corners, frost still clung to shaded walls, but the air had loosened. It moved again, carrying scent, carrying sound. The village no longer felt paused, it felt released. At the house on the edge of the valley, the door opened easily. Inside, the tallies remained. The hearth was cold, the bed untouched. But dust had begun to settle in patterns that suggested movement, air flowing, walls breathing. The visitor stood quietly and did not add anything. No fire was lit, no mark was made. Some stories ended not with action, but with witness. Outside, the river groaned softly as ice gave way at its edges. The lantern beneath the surface was no longer visible, hidden now by clouded water and reflection. Its work was done. The village would not wake, but it would not be frozen forever either. It would return to the land slowly, piece by piece, teaching the valley what it had learned through stillness. The visitor turned away one last time, not carrying the village with them now, but leaving it where it belonged, complete, quiet, and finally at rest. The road out of the valley was wet and uneven, cut through with narrow streams of meltwater that ran without urgency. Snow retreated slowly, surrendering not all at once, but in careful stages, as if unwilling to reveal everything it had kept. The visitor walked part of the way on foot. The ground felt different now, soft in places, brittle in others. Each step left a mark that filled with water almost immediately, erased as soon as it was made. It felt appropriate. Nothing here wanted to be recorded for long. From the ridge, the valley no longer looked like a blank field. Dark shapes interrupted the white. Roof lines, tree trunks, the suggestion of paths that had once been walked daily without thought. The village had returned just enough to be seen, not enough to be disturbed. Far below, water continued to drip. It was the sound of return, not of people, but of motion. The land had begun speaking again. The visitor paused, listening, and realized something quietly important. The valley no longer felt heavy. The stillness that had once pressed inward had loosened. What remained was not silence, but calm, the kind that followed long endurance, when nothing more needed to be proven. Leaving felt easier now. The village had not asked to be remembered loudly. It had not demanded explanation. It had offered its lesson and released it when the season changed. As the visitor moved on, the cold receded into memory, no longer sharp, no longer urgent. It became something else entirely, a reference point, a measure. Not all storms announce themselves, not all dangers rush, and not all losses come with sound. Some arrive quietly, stay patiently, and leave behind only those who learn to listen. The road curved away from the valley, carrying the visitor toward places where summer would eventually arrive, where warmth would return and routines would soften once more. But somewhere, always, beneath new snow or old habit, the understanding remained awake. By early summer, the coldest winter had already begun to feel distant to most people. Fields softened, roads dried, windows were opened again, letting air move freely through rooms that had been sealed for months. Fires were forgotten, heavy blankets were folded and stored away. Conversation turned back to ordinary things, harvests, repairs, plans made with confidence. The visitor noticed how quickly this happened. Warmth returned, and with it came a certain forgetting, not deliberate, not careless, just natural. The body preferred comfort. The mind followed. In one town, the visitor stayed longer than usual. The place was lively now, filled with sound and movement. Children ran along paths that had been impassable only months before. Water flowed freely again, loud and insistent, as if eager to make itself known after so long beneath ice. At night, windows glowed with light. The visitor lay awake more than once, listening to those sounds, measuring them against memory. Warmth made noise. Life announced itself. It was easy in such conditions to believe that danger belonged only to cold seasons, to storms that could be seen and named. But the visitor had learned otherwise. One evening, as the air cooled gently after sunset, a familiar stillness brushed the edge of awareness, not heavy, not threatening, just present. The visitor sat up, listening closely. The stillness passed. Nothing followed it. And yet, that brief moment mattered. It was proof that attentiveness did not belong only to winter, that vigilance, once learned, did not disappear when the snow melted. It simply changed form. The visitor slept after that deeply, without tension, not because the lesson had faded, but because it had settled into something steady, part of how the world was read now, season after season. Some places would forget, others would not, and the difference would never announce itself loudly. Years passed. The valley did not remain empty. Grass returned first, thin and uncertain, pushing through soil that had been locked hard for too long. Then small plants followed, rooting themselves where floors had once been swept and paths had once been cleared. Water pooled in low places, reflecting sky where roofs had collapsed inward. The village did not rebuild itself. It dissolved. Stone walls slumped and were claimed by moss. Wooden beams softened, darkened, and slowly became part of the ground. The outlines of houses blurred until they looked like nothing more than gentle rises in the land. Only those who knew where to stand could trace the old streets with their eyes. Animals arrived quietly. Deer crossed the valley at dawn. Birds nested where windows had once been. The river, freed completely from ice, widened its voice, carrying meltwater and memory downstream without pause. From a distance, nothing suggested that people had ever lived there. Up close, traces remained. A smooth stone worn flat by countless steps. A rusted hinge half buried in earth. A hearthstone that still held warmth longer than the ground around it when the sun touched it. The land remembered, even when people did not. The visitor returned once more, much later, not out of duty, not out of loss, but out of quiet curiosity. Standing at the ridge, they felt no heaviness now, only recognition. This was how places healed, not by being restored to what they were, but by becoming something else entirely. The coldest storm had passed into history, unrecorded by name or date. No marker stood, no warning sign remained. And yet the valley carried its lesson in every softened edge and reclaimed space. Nothing here slept any more. Everything moved slowly, patiently, awake in the way only land can be. The visitor stood for a long time, then turned away, leaving the valley to its own gentle future. The winter of the coldest storm never received a name. It passed through records as a season of low temperatures, of delayed travel, of hardship endured and overcome. Numbers were written down, comparisons were made, new measures were put in place. Then attention moved on. No one spoke of the village. There was no reason to. No one had been waiting for news from that valley. No trade route depended on it. No family beyond the hills marked its silence with concern. Absence, when it arrives quietly enough, often goes unremarked. The visitor understood this better with time. There were moments, rare ones, when the urge arose to speak of the place, to describe the tallies on the wall, the lantern beneath the ice, the way sleep had arrived like a kindness and left like a decision. But words felt inadequate. They flattened what had been precise. They turned something careful into something dramatic. So the story was never told. Instead, it lived on in smaller ways, in how the visitor paused before sleeping during long, soundless nights, in how fires were fed slowly, not generously, in how silence was listened to, not trusted. Years later, when another severe winter arrived elsewhere, the visitor noticed familiar signs again, not catastrophe, not panic, but the quiet conditions that preceded them. A stillness that lingered too long, a cold that settled instead of moving on. This time, the outcome was different. People stayed awake. People shared the watch. Light lasted through the longest hours. No one ever knew how close it had come to repeating itself. And that perhaps was the village's final gift. Not remembrance, not warning, but prevention carried invisibly forward by someone who had learned to listen when the world grew too quiet. The coldest storm had taken a village, but it had also shaped a way of seeing, one that remained awake long after the snow had melted, long after the valley had returned to earth. Time widened. What had once felt immediate, the cold, the waiting, the stillness, spread out and softened as years layered themselves one over another. Seasons passed in their ordinary ways. Winters came and went, some sharp, some forgiving, none quite like the one that had changed the valley. The visitor grew older, not noticeably at first, only in small ways. How the body measured cold more quickly, how rest was chosen more carefully, how silence was no longer empty, but full of signals waiting to be read. In quiet moments the valley returned again, not as a place, but as a reference. When storms gathered, the visitor noticed how people spoke about them, whether they laughed them off or prepared quietly, whether they trusted habit or watched conditions as they unfolded. These small differences mattered more than strength or supplies ever did. Once, years later, someone asked a simple question by a fire late at night. "Why do you always wake before dawn?" The visitor thought for a long moment before answering. "It's when the world is most honest," they said at last. That was enough. The habit passed on that way, not as instruction, but as example. Others began to wake early too. Others listened more carefully to nights that stretched too long, to quiet that lingered without explanation. No one knew why, and they didn't need to. The valley no longer existed as a village. The storm no longer existed as an event. What remained was smaller and stronger than both. a way of paying attention that moved from person to person without ever being named. Some nights, when the air grew very still, the visitor would step outside and stand quietly, letting the cold speak first. And when it did, the message was always the same, gentle and exact. Nothing dangerous arrives loudly. Nothing important is learned in haste. And sleep, like trust, must be given carefully. The world turned on. Winter returned when it wished. Spring followed, patient as ever. And somewhere, in ways that could never be measured, the village continued, not as a place that slept through the coldest storm, but as the reason others did not. There came a night, many years later, when the air changed in a way that felt instantly familiar. It was not especially cold, not yet. The temperature had fallen gently, as it often did after sunset, and the sky was clear enough to show a scatter of distant stars. Most people would have called it an ordinary winter night. The visitor did not. They felt it while standing still, coat unbuttoned, breath slow. The quiet had gathered too neatly. Sound did not fade naturally. It stopped. Wind, which had been restless all afternoon, had vanished without transition. Even the smallest movement seemed reluctant to disturb the air. The old awareness stirred. Inside nearby houses, lights glowed warmly. Curtains were drawn. Laughter drifted faintly through walls and then fell away. Fires burned bright, fed generously, flames rising high with confidence. The visitor walked the length of the street unhurried. At each house, the same pattern repeated. Comfort, routine, trust. None of it was wrong. None of it was dangerous yet. But together, under the wrong conditions, it could become something else. Stopping near the edge of the settlement, the visitor looked toward the open land beyond. Snow lay smooth there, untouched. The horizon felt closer than it should have been, as though the world had leaned inward slightly. The night reminded them of the valley, not in its severity, but in its posture. The visitor returned home and did something small. They turned their fire down instead of up. They set aside extra fuel within reach. They left a lamp burning low through the night. Then they stayed awake a little longer than usual, not standing, not pacing, simply listening. Hours passed. The cold deepened slowly, testing, measuring. It did not cross the threshold it needed to become dangerous. By dawn, a faint wind returned, loosening the air, allowing sound to move again. Morning came. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. The visitor knew then that the lesson of the village was no longer tied to loss or memory. It had become instinct, something that acted quietly before danger could finish forming. That was how the village survived now, not in stone or snow, but in the moments when someone noticed a night that felt too still and chose to remain awake just a little longer. From that night on, the visitor no longer thought of vigilance as something deliberate. It happened on its own. There were evenings when the body simply refused to sink fully into rest, when sleep hovered close but did not claim its usual authority. On those nights, the visitor did not resist or force wakefulness. They accepted it, the way one accepts weather, by adjusting posture, by listening, by waiting. Others began to do the same, not because they had been told to, not because they sensed danger, but because something subtle had shifted in how nights were felt. People lingered a little longer by windows. Fires were watched instead of abandoned to burn themselves out. Lamps were turned low rather than off completely. No one spoke of it. There was no signal, no call, no agreement made. It was simply understood that when the world grew unusually quiet, someone would be awake. Sometimes it was the visitor. Sometimes it was someone else. The watch moved without schedule or title. It belonged to the night itself, answering only when asked. Most of the time, nothing followed. The cold tested the edges, then withdrew. The silence gathered briefly, then loosened. Dawn arrived as it always had, pale and unremarkable. And that was enough, because the goal was never confrontation, never endurance for its own sake. The goal was balance, meeting stillness with attention, meeting rest with restraint. Years passed this way, gently. The visitor aged further, but the watch did not weaken. It changed hands without ceremony. Younger people learned without realizing they were learning. They sensed when to sleep deeply and when to remain light, when to trust the night and when to listen to it more closely. The village in the valley would never be rebuilt. It did not need to be. What it had become was quieter and more durable than stone, a way of meeting winter without arrogance, without fear, and without surrender. And somewhere, on a night that felt just a little too still, someone stood at a window, breathed slowly, and stayed awake, without ever knowing why. Silence no longer felt empty. It had texture now, layers that could be sensed if one listened long enough. The visitor noticed how different kinds of quiet behaved. There was the ordinary quiet of snow absorbing sound, soft and forgiving. There was the living quiet of a resting place, where breath, walls, and earth still shifted gently beneath the stillness. And then there was the other kind, the kind that pressed inward. That silence did not arrive suddenly. It settled gradually, smoothing the edges of sound until even memory felt muted. It was the silence that had filled the valley long ago, the silence that had mistaken itself for peace. When it appeared now, even briefly, it no longer went unnoticed. On such nights, people moved differently. Steps were slower. Doors were closed more carefully. Someone always seemed to remain awake without planning to, eyes open in the half-light, listening for the smallest change. No one feared these nights. They respected them. Respect made all the difference. The visitor sometimes thought of the first vigil, the lonely one, carved into stone by someone who had stood awake while an entire village slept. That person had borne the weight alone, without knowing whether it would matter. Now it did. The weight was shared invisibly, spread thin across many shoulders, so light that no one felt burdened by it. Attention had replaced endurance. Awareness had replaced struggle. Winter still came, storms still passed. But silence no longer ruled unchallenged. It was met gently, patiently, by those who had learned that rest was safest when balanced with listening. And so the world continued, unchanged on the surface, altered in its quiet depths, carrying forward a lesson born in a valley that slept once and would never need to again. Attention, once learned, reshaped everything. It changed how rooms were entered, pausing just long enough to feel the air. It changed how fires were tended, fed steadily instead of generously. It changed how sleep was taken, not as a plunge into darkness, but as a gradual settling, with part of the mind left near the surface. The visitor noticed how this attention had a shape. It was not sharp, not anxious. It did not scan for danger or imagine it where none existed. Instead, it curved gently outward like a hand resting on cold stone, sensing temperature without gripping. On winter nights, this shape appeared naturally. Someone would wake and sit quietly, not to watch but to be present. Another might step outside for a moment, feel the air on their face, then return without comment. These actions left no trace by morning, yet they altered outcomes all the same. Once, during a prolonged cold spell, the visitor observed a small moment that captured everything. A fire burned low in a shared space. Several people slept nearby. One person, awake but unremarkable, rose and adjusted a log, not adding fuel, not reducing it, simply shifting it so the heat would last longer. Then they sat again, eyes open, breath slow. No one noticed, and nothing happened, which meant everything had gone exactly as it should. The visitor felt a quiet gratitude, not toward the person, but toward the unseen chain that connected them to a valley long reclaimed by grass and water. A line of attention stretched across time, unbroken, invisible, strong. The cold outside pressed in, tested, waited. Inside, warmth held. By morning, the air moved again. Sound returned. The moment passed without memory. That was the shape of attention at work, not dramatic, not celebrated, but precise enough to matter. And somewhere beneath old snow and new soil, the valley remained what it had become, not a warning carved in stone, but a lesson carried forward in the smallest, quietest choices. There came a time when the visitor realized they no longer waited for winter with concern, not because winter had grown gentler and not because danger had vanished, but because awareness had become part of living, as natural as breathing. The cold arrived when it wished. Silence gathered when conditions allowed. Neither felt like a threat anymore. They were simply states to be met. On a quiet evening, long after the valley had faded into soil and grass, the visitor sat by a window and watched the last light leave the sky. The world outside settled into shadow. A thin frost began to form along the ground, delicate and exact. Inside, a fire burned low and steady. The visitor listened, not for warning, not for memory, but for balance. The air moved gently. Sound traveled again. Sleep would come, and it would be safe. That, at last, was the difference. The lesson of the village had not been about resisting the cold or conquering storms or staying awake forever. It had been about knowing when to sleep and when not to, about understanding that comfort is not the same as safety and that quiet deserves attention, not trust. The world outside continued its long turning. Winters followed summers, storms followed calm, silence followed noise. And within that rhythm, something remained awake, not as a burden, not as fear, but as a calm presence that rose only when needed. The coldest storm had taken a village once. It would not take another, not because the world had changed, but because someone somewhere would always pause on a too quiet night, feel the weight of the air, and choose to listen just a little longer. The visitor did not think of it as a legacy. Legacies implied intention, planning, something passed down with words and ceremony. What had grown instead was quieter than that, an inheritance without a name, carried not through stories told aloud, but through moments noticed and acted upon. It appeared in small, ordinary ways, in how someone paused before extinguishing a lamp, in how a door was checked twice, not from worry, but from care, in how sleep was taken lightly on nights that felt too smooth, too sealed. The visitor saw it most clearly in others, people who had never heard of the valley, who could not have pointed to it on any map, yet who behaved as if they understood its lesson instinctively. They listened to silence the way one listens to water or wind, not assuming its meaning, but respecting its presence. On one winter evening, the visitor watched a young person step outside alone, stand still for a few breaths, then return inside without explanation. Nothing followed, no storm deepened, no danger arrived. Still, the action mattered, because it meant the inheritance was alive, not fixed, not complete, but moving, subtle as heat traveling through stone, slow enough to last. The visitor felt no pride in this. Oh, only relief. The valley had not been forgotten. It had been transformed into something safer than memory, awareness that did not need tragedy to justify itself. And so, the nights continued to pass, most of them harmless, some of them sharp, a few of them very quiet. And on those nights somewhere, someone would remain awake, not standing against the cold, not fearing it, but listening, balanced between rest and attention, carrying forward what could never be written down. Most nights ended the same way. Dawn arrived without announcement. Light seeped into rooms gradually, lifting shadow from corners, revealing nothing out of place. Fires cooled naturally, doors opened, voices returned. The night, however quiet it had been, left no mark. These were the nights when nothing happened. They were the most important ones. The visitor understood this deeply now. Catastrophe teaches loudly, but briefly. Prevention teaches silently and forever. When nothing happened, it meant attention had been enough. Balance had been found. The cold had tested the edges and found no invitation to stay. People rarely noticed these successes. They remembered storms that damaged roofs. They remembered nights that frightened them. They remembered hardship. They did not remember the hundreds of times when a single decision, a lamp left burning, a fire tended carefully, a person staying awake just a little longer, had kept danger from forming at all. But the body remembered. The body learned the rhythm of safe rest. The mind learned the texture of harmless silence versus the heavy stillness that asked questions. Over time, this learning became instinct, invisible and unremarkable. The visitor felt comfort in that. The world did not need heroes standing against winter. It needed listeners. As another winter passed without incident, the valley returned once more, not as image, not as memory, but as confirmation. The village had not been lost for nothing. Its stillness had become motion elsewhere, its silence translated into countless small acts of care. The cold would always return, silence would always gather, but now so would attention, and more often than not, nothing would happen at all. There was one night, late in winter, when the visitor felt the pull of sleep more strongly than usual. The day had been long, the work ordinary but steady. The body carried a pleasant weight, the kind that came from effort rather than exhaustion. Outside, snow fell lightly, just enough to soften the world without erasing it. The air moved, sound traveled. Everything suggested safety. This was the kind of night when vigilance felt unnecessary. The visitor sat by the fire, watching the low flame bend and straighten, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling. Sleep waited close now, not insistent, just present, an open door rather than a demand. Before yielding to it, the visitor paused, not out of fear, not out of memory, out of habit. They stood, walked slowly through the room, and placed a hand against the wall. Cold, but not deep. Alive. Responsive. The window was checked, not for frost, but for air. A faint draft moved through, gentle and reassuring. Outside, the night answered quietly. Wind touched the trees. Snow whispered as it fell. Somewhere far off, a sound carried and faded naturally. The silence had space in it. It was not sealed. That was enough. The visitor returned to the chair, adjusted the fire just slightly, then allowed sleep to come fully this time, not lightly, not guarded, deep and unbroken. Morning arrived without interruption. The fire had burned down exactly as intended. The room held warmth. The world beyond the window was unchanged, waiting calmly for the day to begin. The visitor understood then that the lesson of the valley did not require constant wakefulness. It required discernment, knowing when attention was needed and when rest could be trusted. Sleep taken at the right moment was not surrender. It was balance. And balance, once learned, was the quietest form of safety. Time continued as it always did, without ceremony. The visitor grew older in ways that were not immediately visible. Strength remained, but it arrived more slowly. Cold was still understood, but the body felt it sooner than before. Nights were valued differently now, not as tests, but as spaces where attention and rest shared the same room. Gradually, without decision, the watch passed on. It did not move from one person to another in a single moment. It thinned, spread, and settled. Others had learned the signs well enough that the visitor no longer needed to notice them first. Someone else would pause at a window. Someone else would adjust a fire. Someone else would remain awake on a night that felt too smooth, too quiet. The visitor observed this with a quiet sense of completion, not pride, not relief, just certainty. On one winter evening, snow fell steadily, building gently against walls and steps. The visitor sat near the hearth and felt no need to stand. The air moved as it should. The silence held sound within it. Nothing pressed inward. Sleep came easily, and it stayed. Outside, the night passed as all good nights do, unremarkable, patient, brief. By morning, footprints marked the snow where others had moved before dawn. A fire still burned low. A lamp had been left lit, then turned off at the right hour. The watch had not ended. It had simply become shared enough to be invisible. Somewhere far away the valley rested as it always had, no longer frozen, no longer silent, just land, water, and memory folded gently into the world. And here now, winter moved through another place without taking anything with it. With time, even the sharpest memories lose their edges. The visitor noticed this not with sadness, but with curiosity. The valley no longer arrived whole and clear in the mind. Details blurred, the exact shape of the tallies, the angle of the lantern beneath the ice, the precise sound of the river at night. These things softened like footprints, filling slowly with snow. What remained was not image, but feeling. A quiet respect for nights that lingered too long, a gentle hesitation before complete rest, a trust in listening more than acting. These were lighter to carry than memory. On a late winter afternoon, the visitor walked a familiar path where snow had begun to melt unevenly. Water dripped from branches. The ground released the faint scent of earth beneath ice. The world felt in between states, neither sleeping nor fully awake. The visitor paused, feeling that same in-between quality settle inside. It was comforting. Nothing needed to be held tightly anymore. The lesson had already taken root beyond the need for recall. It lived now in choices made without thought, in pauses taken without reason, in nights allowed to unfold naturally, unless they asked for attention. That, the visitor understood, was how knowledge endured, not as a story repeated, not as a warning remembered, but as a way of moving through the world that remained long after the reason for it had faded. The valley no longer needed to be visited, even in thought. It had done its work. The world did not change all at once. There were still winters that surprised people, still storms that closed roads and emptied shelves, still nights when confidence outpaced preparation. The difference was subtle and easily overlooked. Someone stayed awake, someone noticed, someone adjusted something small, and because of that, the worst moments often never arrived. The visitor saw this again and again, not as proof of influence, but as confirmation of continuity. The lesson had detached itself from any single person. It had become part of how certain places breathed through winter. In one town, it showed itself in how neighbors checked on one another without making it an event. In another, in how shared spaces were kept ready through long nights, not locked and forgotten. Elsewhere, in how silence was met with curiosity rather than assumption. No one credited a source. No one needed to. The visitor understood now that the village had not been a beginning or an ending. It had been a turning point so quiet that it barely registered at all, except in the outcomes that never made headlines, never required explanation. The cold still arrived, the silence still tested, sleep still tempted, but the balance held. As evening fell on another ordinary day, the visitor stood briefly at a window, watched the light fade, and felt no urgency. The air moved gently. Sound carried. The night felt honest. That was enough. The world had learned, not through warning or loss, but through attention, passed hand to hand, night to night, season to season. And somewhere beneath old snow and newer grass, a valley rested, no longer a place that slept through the coldest storm, but the quiet reason so many others did not. One evening, unremarkable in every visible way, the visitor sat alone as dusk settled. There was no storm approaching, no forecast of danger. The sky dimmed gently, colors thinning into gray, then blue. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. Farther off, a sound carried and faded as it should. The kind of evening most people forgot entirely. The visitor noticed how easily comfort returned on such nights, how naturally the body leaned toward rest when nothing demanded attention. This, too, was part of the lesson. Danger did not live only in hardship. It sometimes arrived when everything felt easy. So the visitor did something small. They sat quietly a moment longer before sleeping. They listened without expectation. They let the air speak first. Nothing followed. The quiet remained open, breathable, ordinary. Satisfied, the visitor rested. Morning came cleanly. No trace remained of the pause, no mark of vigilance. The day unfolded without resistance, and yet that pause mattered, because it kept the practice alive, not sharpened by fear, not dulled by routine, but present even when it seemed unnecessary. Especially then. The visitor understood now that this was the final shape of the lesson, a tension woven so gently into life that it never interrupted it. The coldest storm had once asked everything of a village. What remained asked very little. Just listening, just balance. Just one small moment of awareness offered freely, night after night. There was no moment when the visitor decided the story was complete. Stories like this did not close themselves with clear lines or final images. They thinned instead, spreading out until they became indistinguishable from ordinary life. One day the valley was no longer thought of at all. Another day, its lesson surfaced without a name, guiding a hand, delaying sleep, softening a decision. This was how it ended, not with remembrance, but with integration. The visitor moved through seasons that no longer felt like tests. Winter returned as it always would, bringing cold and quiet and long nights. But those nights were no longer empty. They were inhabited by small, shared acts of care that needed no explanation. Somewhere, someone stayed awake for no reason they could articulate. Somewhere else, a fire was kept low and steady instead of bright and wasteful. Somewhere, a lamp burned just long enough. Nothing dramatic followed, and that was the point. The village that once slept through the coldest storm no longer existed as a place or even as a memory held intact. It existed as a pattern, subtle, persistent, unremarkable, woven into the way people met silence and rest. The world did not become safer, it became wiser. And wisdom, unlike walls or fire, did not need to be rebuilt. It moved quietly without asking for attention, carried forward by those who had learned, without ever knowing when or how, that the coldest dangers often arrived gently, and that listening, done patiently, was sometimes enough to let them pass. There came a night when the visitor no longer recognized themselves as such. They were not arriving anywhere. They were not leaving anything behind. They were simply there, part of the place they stood in, part of the rhythm that moved through it. The idea of a beginning or an origin felt distant now, unnecessary. What mattered was the present moment and how it was met. The night was cool, not cold, quiet but not sealed. The visitor stood outside briefly, feeling the air rest against the skin. It carried movement within it, subtle but real. Somewhere water flowed. Somewhere something living shifted in its sleep. Silence here had space. Satisfied, the visitor returned indoors and rested. Sleep came naturally, without effort, without resistance. It was deep and deserved, the kind that restores rather than takes. Outside, the night passed as it should, leaving nothing behind. By morning, the visitor woke with no sense of having guarded anything, and yet the watch had been kept. That was the final truth of it. Vigilance had not replaced life. It had blended into it so completely that it no longer felt like vigilance at all. Listening had become as natural as breathing. Balance had become instinct. The village was no longer remembered. The storm was no longer feared. The lesson no longer needed a bearer. It had moved fully into the world. And so the story did not end with a warning or a monument or a name carved into stone. It ended with something far quieter and far stronger, a night that passed safely, a sleep that came at the right moment, a world that listened just enough. Nothing marked the moment when the lesson stopped belonging to anyone at all. There was no final passing of hands, no quiet acknowledgement that now it is yours. It simply reached a point where it no longer needed to be carried. It existed on its own, embedded in habits, in pauses, in the way people moved through nights without naming why. The visitor, if they could still be called that, no longer measured quiet against memory. Silence was no longer compared to the valley or to storms past. It was taken as it came, read in its own language, answered only when it asked to be. Most of the time, it asked nothing. That was the truest sign that the world had learned. Winters continued to arrive with their long shadows and early dark. Snow still fell softly enough to make people trust it. Cold still settled when conditions allowed. None of this changed. What changed was the response. A lamp left burning just a little longer. A fire tended with patience instead of urgency. A person awake at the edge of sleep, listening, not out of fear, but out of care. These things left no record, and they didn't need one, because the village that once slept through the coldest storm had already done its final work, not by being remembered, but by becoming unnecessary to remember. The night came, the night passed, nothing was taken. And in that ordinary outcome, so quiet it could be missed entirely, the story found its rest. The night arrived as it always had, without announcement. There was no sense of importance attached to it, no memory stirred, no instinct sharpened suddenly. It was simply evening becoming night, light thinning, shadows lengthening, the world easing into its quieter half. Somewhere a window was closed against the cold. Somewhere else a fire settled into embers. Someone paused before sleep, then rested without thinking twice. No single person was awake for the night, and yet the night was not unattended. Attention existed in pieces now, scattered gently across places and people. It lived in habits so ordinary they escaped notice. It lived in the way silence was allowed to breathe, not rushed to be filled or trusted blindly. The cold tested the edges, as it always did. It found no invitation. Morning followed, pale and unremarkable. Frost lay thin on the ground and melted quickly when the sun touched it. Life moved forward without interruption. No one remarked on the night that had passed, which meant it had gone exactly as it should. The village was no longer a place. The storm was no longer an event. The listener was no longer a person. What remained was balance, quietly maintained, quietly shared, quietly enough. And the world continued, unaware of how close it sometimes came, and how gently it had learned to listen instead. That year's winter ended without being remarked upon. There were storms, of course. There were nights when snow piled higher than expected, and mornings when cold lingered longer than comfort allowed. But none of it stood out. Nothing crossed the invisible line where endurance became danger. People remembered it only vaguely afterward. A winter, a normal one, and that was its quiet success. In homes and shelters, fires had been tended with care rather than urgency. On long nights, someone had always been awake somewhere, not watching, not guarding, simply present. Sleep had come in stages, shared, balanced, responsive. No one coordinated this. No one claimed responsibility. It happened because it had become the way things were done. The visitor, if that word still applied, moved through those months like anyone else. They no longer felt separate from the pattern they had once carried. Their pauses were no longer deliberate. Their listening no longer conscious. The lesson had settled into muscle and breath. One evening near the end of winter, the air grew briefly still, just for a moment, the kind of stillness that once would have tightened the chest. This time it passed without stirring anything more than a gentle awareness. Somewhere a door opened. Somewhere wind returned. Sound moved again, easy and natural. Nothing followed. Spring arrived slowly, without drama. Snow retreated. Water moved freely. The ground softened and released what it had held. Life resumed its familiar rhythms, and beneath all of it, unchanged, unnamed, steady, attention remained. Not sharp, not fearful, just enough. The village had slept once, long ago, through the coldest storm. Now the world slept wisely. Long after that winter faded into the ordinary past, something remained that could not be traced to a single moment. It was not caution, it was not memory, it was not fear, it was a quiet confidence. People trusted sleep again, but not blindly. They trusted warmth, but not wastefully. They trusted silence, but only after listening to it first. These were not rules anyone spoke aloud. They were habits that lived beneath thought, shaped slowly over time. On some nights, the air grew heavy for reasons no one could name. On others, the cold pressed just a little closer than expected. When that happened, there was always a small response, barely visible, barely felt. A lamp stayed on, a fire was checked, a person lingered awake without knowing why, and then the night moved on. No one thanked anyone, no one kept score, nothing dramatic followed. The quiet stayed gentle because it was met gently. Far away where the valley had once been, the land no longer remembered houses or roads. Grass bent to in the wind. Water traced its own paths. Snow still fell there in winter, soft and patient, covering nothing that needed protecting anymore. The village had finished its work. It had not taught the world to fight storms. It had taught it to notice. And noticing, done calmly, done early, had proven enough. The night came, the night passed, and the quiet remained a companion, not a threat. Winter returned, as it always would. Snow fell. Cold settled. Nights lengthened until evenings felt brief and mornings slow to arrive. None of this felt remarkable anymore. The season had returned to its proper place, not as an adversary, not as a test, but as a presence to live alongside. People prepared without urgency. Fuel was gathered steadily, not in panic. Doors were sealed carefully, not obsessively. Sleep was taken when it felt right, and delayed when it did not. These decisions were made without discussion, guided by something quieter than thought. The visitor, now fully part of this world, noticed how little effort it took. What once required discipline now required nothing at all. The body recognized the signals before the mind named them. The air spoke, and it was heard. Silence arrived, and it was met with the appropriate response, sometimes rest, sometimes awareness, often both. There were storms that year, strong ones, but they moved through places that were ready in small, unremarkable ways. Fires lasted through the night. People checked on one another naturally. The cold tested, found resistance, and passed on. By spring, no one spoke of survival. They spoke of weather, of routines, of ordinary things, and that was the final measure of success. The coldest storm had once revealed how fragile trust could be when left unquestioned. Now trust had matured, tempered by listening, strengthened by balance. Winter had become ordinary again, not harmless, just understood. In the end, there was nothing left to watch. The night came and went as nights always had, without ceremony, without consequence. Snow fell when it wished. Cold settled where it could. Sleep arrived and departed in its natural rhythm, no longer mistaken for safety, no longer feared as surrender. The world had found its balance. Somewhere, far beneath layers of soil and seasons, the valley rested in its final form. No houses, no paths, no doors to open or fires to tend. Just land shaped gently by time, holding no urgency, asking nothing. The village never woke. It didn't need to. Its work had been done quietly, completely, without ever knowing it would matter. What it lost, the world gained in a way that could not be measured or recorded. Not as memory, not as warning, but as understanding woven so deeply into ordinary life that it no longer felt learned at all. Winter returned. Winter passed. Nights grew quiet, then loosened again. Sleep came, then left, and nothing was taken. That was the true ending of the coldest storm. Not silence, not loss, not fear, but a world that learned to listen just enough, rest just enough, and remain awake only when it mattered. The village slept through the coldest storm, so that everywhere else, someday, no one would have to.